have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
Coming up this week, the sensual adventure in geopolitical ASMR you've all been waiting for. Two men talking to themselves on their mobile phones in separate locations. With Philip Pilkington presently locked in a hotel room in China, it seems Andrew is penning him Sleepless in Seattle style voice notes from Northumberland. Dynamic, digital, dangerous, disestablishmentarian. How much of this you can handle is up to you. 2 audio essays. Dial in now. Skip to 35 minutes and 10 seconds to hear Philip Pilkington talk about how much he hates Javier Milei and how hard you should short your pesos.
But on line 1.
Stay right where you are to hear the Geordie smoothie, Andrew,
Andy Collingwood,
talking about a nuclear umbrella and how it could be flopped out right in the middle of a Persian Gulf. This is geopolitics as you've never heard it before. Wild, wired, and Weltanschauung. But first,
2 news stories emerged last week that seem unrelated. One of them was something of a bombshell. The other was a minor report about really a symbolic gesture. But both of the stories are connected. And this week I hope to explain how they're connected and what they mean. So, what has a defensive alliance between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia that appears to extend Pakistan's nuclear umbrella over the Arabian Peninsula got to do with news stories emerging that the United Kingdom is getting ready to place nuclear-capable jets in Estonia? Well, I mean, what have they got in common apart from the mention of nuclear weapons? Or, I mean, maybe to put it a better way, why are there developments involving nuclear weapons now? Why are these stories emerging now about nuclear weapons? The proximate causes of both stories appear to be entirely different. Britain is sending jets to Estonia in part because of its commitment to defend NATO's eastern frontier against the evil and dastardly Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, the proximate cause of the Pakistan-Saudi Arabia agreement seems to have been entirely unconnected with that. It seems to be the Israeli attack on Qatar to kill Hamas's leadership. But they are connected. They're connected because the US is leaving Europe and the Middle East. It was previously the guarantor of security in Europe and the Middle East, and it was the ultimate arbiter of conflict in both of those theatres. Now, clearly, in my view, what's happening is regional powers in both the Middle East and Europe are starting to prepare for a world without Uncle Sam. And what we're seeing is the pieces move across the chessboard in preparation for that world. So what are the moves being made and what does it mean for overall global geostrategy? So here's where I think it gets interesting. Let's look at Britain's decision to send nuclear-capable jets to Estonia first. Okay, that's the story we'll focus on first. Without the United States, Europe faces 3 strategic risks. We've spoken about these before on Multipolarity, but let's quickly review them again. The first major risk is that it becomes ultimately a playing field for outside powers, much, in fact, as the Middle East has been since the discovery of oil in the Middle East. If the EU is weak and divided, and yet it is still a valuable market and geographical location, then it will inevitably become a playing field for outside powers. Not just the big global powers like the US and China, but also the flanking powers like Britain, Russia, and Turkey. It doesn't want that to happen. We've seen what a horror show that's created, that sort of environment is created in the Middle East. The second strategic risk is that it just ends up being strategically impotent without being able to grab on to Washington's coattails, without having the military to back up increasingly waning economic power. It would end up just being unable to do anything to impose its interests or to impose the strategic direction in which it wants to go on. Thirdly, it risks the re-emergence of intra-European security competition, which was what twice in the first half of the 20th century dragged the world into catastrophic global wars. The process of rearmament to account for the fact the US is leaving. I mean, the US is going to leave, so individual European countries are going to have to spend more on their own defense. In the medium and in the long term, they're going to have to provide for their own security. That's going to mean some degree of rearmament. And countries may well start to respond to the rearmament of other countries in Europe. I mean, for example, Friedrich Merz is talking about building the most powerful army in Europe. Do we really think, given history, given their locations, that France and Poland would not have to account for Germany constructing the most powerful army in Europe? And if they did start to account for it, would then not Germany have to account for that response? This is the kind of tragic logic of security competition. This is what realists always talk about, the tragedy of great power politics. It would and it could happen again if things go in a certain direction. Now, the logical solution to all of those three risks would be a fully integrated military force that was under European rather than national command. That would end any possibility of the re-emergence of security competition, right? Because all of the rearmament would happen within a unified structure. It would also give Europe geostrategic heft, obviously. And finally, it would protect it from becoming a playing field for outside powers. So it's like a unified European force is the kind of the ultimate solution to all of these major risks. And at the same time, it happens to be exactly what the European federalist sorts, aka the European establishment, actually want. They would love that because it would be another piece in the puzzle of building a federalized European superstate. Now, I confess that although the logic behind a unified European military is sound, it's, the strategic logic is obvious, the political logic is obvious. It is, I would say, to put it very mildly, to be very generous, hugely questionable whether the Europeans are going to be able to manage such a thing. I mean, it takes them forever to agree on minor regulatory details, let alone something that would be as incendiary to concepts like national identity and national sovereignty as a European army under Brussels command. You can only imagine the response in places like, Hungary and non-metropolitan France and places like Britain as well. But let's imagine for a moment that they could do that. Let's just imagine it to be. One thing that any force with strategic heft and serious deterrence power would need would be a nuclear deterrent. And at present, no European country has a full-scale nuclear deterrence. Whoa. Hang on, Andy, you're saying. What about Britain and France? They've got nuclear weapons. They've got a nuclear deterrent, haven't they? No, they haven't. Let's look at Britain, for example. The UK nuclear deterrent is entirely submarine-launched Trident missiles. Now, these are very capable bits of kit. I mean, awesome bits of kit. The technology behind them is fantastic. They can deliver multiple nuclear warheads that can be dialed up to almost half a megaton, and they can deliver them over many, many thousands of miles onto their targets with great accuracy, with a circular error probability of 100 or 50 meters even, which is more than accurate enough when you're talking about half a megaton's worth of explosives. But that's the point. They are strategic weapons. They're city killers. You launch a Trident missile with its 3 or its 8 warheads, each of which can be dialed up to 475 kilotons at a city, and woof, it's gone. That's it. Right? They're city killers. They're strategic weapons. So let's imagine Britain is in some kind of military conflict with a hypothetical nuclear power. Let's call this imaginary power Slavlandia. Okay? So Slavlandia, let's imagine it fires a low kiloton range tactical nuclear weapon, or even several of them actually, onto the battlefield to halt an attack by British and Allied forces. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it fires something similar at a Royal Navy carrier strike group. Right? So you got this low kiloton range tactical nuke, maybe it's 8 kilotons, 7 kilotons, 10 kilotons, fired at the battlefield, or fired at an aircraft carrier strike group of Britons. Is the UK government really going to escalate to a half megaton city killer with all the likely, response, mutually assured destruction that means, in response to an 8 kiloton tactical nuke? No, almost certainly it's not. And the leadership of Slavlandia almost certainly know that Britain almost certainly wouldn't do that. So that's to say that Britain, and France is in the same boat too, has a nuclear deterrent against strategic, or what's known as counter-value nuclear strike, but not tactical, what's known as counter-force nuclear strike. So that's why, now that the US no longer seems certain to be Europe and Britain's security guarantor, that's why Britain is looking, news reports have emerged recently, into developing tactical air-launched nuclear missiles that could be fired from their F-35s. Or nuclear weapons that could be gravity bombs, for example. It realizes that it is now necessary to develop a full suite nuclear deterrent that it could use independent of the US, right? And it doesn't have one at the minute. So, getting back to the story about these nuclear-capable jets going to Estonia, if Britain doesn't have this nuclear deterrent at the moment, is the fact that Daily Telegraph, which is Britain's most jingoistic broadsheet, is the Daily Telegraph reporting this nuclear-capable fighter jets from Britain going to Estonia? Is it doing that just because it's good for the Daily Telegraph readership, which is, your stereotypical retired colonel in the home counties? Again, not quite. It's not just about some jingo clickbait. Back to Europe's combined military force. As we said, such a force would require a full suite nuclear deterrent. And it's also true that even though the EU is unlikely to be able to pull off the creation of a unified military force, if it did, Britain's time as an independent nation would be over. You've got to remember that a unified European economy marshalling a unified military is exactly what Great Britain has fought for, 3-4 centuries to avoid. And that included literally committing imperial and national suicide between 1914 and 1945. That's how important it was for Britain to avoid that outcome. If it did happen, though, Britain would have to get in right from the very beginning. It would have to do so, and it would have to try to give itself a seat at the negotiating table. And this is what I think the UK strategists are now signaling. They're signaling We are going to develop our own nuclear deterrent, and we are not afraid to forward deploy it to Europe's eastern approaches and put it at the disposal of Europe's defence. That's what I think they're signalling. Now, all this is obviously, symbolic, and posturing on a lot of levels. Britain is symbolising that it would be willing to send nukes that it only symbolically has. And by the way, given the state of the British economy, it might not even be able to afford to develop. And it's doing that to aid with the defensive effort that probably won't be needed within a military force that almost certainly won't be created. But what I'm trying to say is that is the strategy that Britain is kind of haphazardly thinking and fumbling toward. And it's something that's happening because the US is retreating, or looking as though it is going to retreat from Europe. Okay? So, moving on to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia signing this defense pact. That seems like much bigger news, but I can tell you, at its root cause is the same thing. The US is retreating from the Middle East. Right, let's start. The biggest highlight of this Pakistan-Saudi Arabia deal is that they've agreed to something like NATO's Article 5. They've agreed that an attack on one country would be seen as an attack on both, and they would each take such steps as they deem necessary to respond to that attack. That's pretty big. It's also included, apparently, Pakistan's nuclear deterrent, which will be extended to Saudi Arabia. That's very big. But why has this happened now? Well, the first thing you got to remember is that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have been very friendly for a long time. Saudi Arabia supported Pakistan in Pakistan's efforts in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion in the 1980s, and it's widely believed, but nobody says for certain, that Saudi Arabia helped fund the AQ Khan network that finally led to Pakistan gaining nuclear weapons in the first place. It has long been thought a possibility in Western policy circles that if Saudi Arabia was ever threatened with nuclear weapons, Pakistan would come to the aid and extend its nuclear umbrella over Pakistan. So why now? Like, why is this happening now? That, as I say, is the big question. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the proximate cause is Israel's attack on Qatar. And given Israel has nuclear weapons and Saudi Arabia doesn't, Riyadh is probably thinking that it would be sensible if Israel is in this mood where it's just going around the Middle East, not caring about sovereignty, not caring about the safety of any, civilians in the air, and just whacking people that it doesn't like. Well, maybe the potential for a Saudi-Israeli standoff or, conflict between Saudi Arabia and Israel is important, and it ought to improve its security position, right? That seems very sensible. But really, when you look at it, how likely is this? First of all, Israel is also a nuclear power. So how likely is Pakistan to risk mutual annihilation with Israel over a conflict between Israel and Saudi Arabia? And secondly, how likely are the Saudis even to get into a conflict with Israel? Saudi was the friendliest of the Arab nations with Israel. Until the October 7th attack for a couple of years ago, they were pretty close to concluding another leg of the Abraham Accords. And unlike Qatar, Saudi Arabia doesn't host Hamas and Hezbollah leadership. So what's up? Why sign this thing? Well, again, as I said, it's because the US is leaving. Saudi Arabia now must take steps to provide for its defense in a very dangerous neighborhood. Now, yes, that means deterring Israel. There's no conflict right now, but that doesn't mean that there never will be. Right? And Israel needs deterring because it is the only nation that the US will not abandon ever, right? I think that much has been made clear. But it also needs to deter Iran, its biggest strategic rival in the region, or as has been for however many years, decades, literally. Recall that Multipolarity has argued that since the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, the big outcome would be to convince Tehran that, one, it would have to develop nuclear weapons, and two, in order to achieve that, it would need a credible defense against air attack from Israel, which would require swallowing its pride, ending its kind of we'll do everything ourselves regional great power strategy, and going to the Russians and the Chinese for an integrated air defense system and a fleet of modern fighter jets and AWACS planes. Now that means that it makes sense for Saudi Arabia to be prepared for the moment that Iran proliferates, to be prepared for the moment that Iran gets this kind of fighter jets and AWACS, which, let's not forget, could be used offensively as well as defensively. Now that doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia is going to get involved in an arms race with Iran or is going to be an enemy of Iran or a great rival. We've reported on Multipolarity for years now that actually a rapprochement is happening, a kind of détente between Riyadh and Tehran, brokered originally by the Chinese. That still holds, but this is classic strategy that we in the West have forgotten, because for decades since the Second World War, we've been held together by a tightly bounded international order where people agree on almost everything, they cooperate on almost everything. We work together as one unit under the US, under US leadership. Okay? So we're just not used to how classical geopolitics and classical strategy is happening. And the tactic is very simple. You have rapprochement and détente, but importantly, reassurance with your past rival, while at the same time building alliances to help balance and strengthen your position against that rival. It's a dual strategy. You offer reassurance and détente on the one hand, and you strengthen yourself on the other hand. And as you strengthen yourself, you reassure the other side that this isn't offensive, and you offer credible concessions to do so. That's how it works, okay? So what's the upside of all this? What's the upside of the Saudis and the Pakistanis signing this defense agreement that gives both sides NATO Article 5-like coverage? Well, firstly, it's a big win en passant for Beijing. China already provides Pakistan with its weapons, or a lot of its weapons. Some are US, but the most modern fighter jets are Chinese. So that kind of ties Pakistan in, because its security is to a large part dependent on Beijing. So that ties Pakistan into China's orbit. Traditionally, China has also found Pakistan useful as a tool against India, or at least balance against India. Now it appears set to provide Iran with the same service, modern fighter jets and some AWACS planes. It already sold Saudi Arabia ballistic missiles, and recently it's been helping Saudi Arabia build those missiles in Saudi Arabia. Okay? So, got Pakistan, probably Iran in the future, some weapons, ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia, which could be converted to nuclear, by the way, just saying. It shows that in addition to this deal that they have done with between Riyadh and Tehran, they've brokered this détente, and the fact that they are now a major buyer of Saudi oil, in fact, I think the major buyer of Saudi oil, it shows how that China is expanding its influence westward, pushing into this region. Now let's go to India. India's got to be concerned now. I mean, this must be really concerning for India, because theoretically, at least, it could lose access to Saudi oil in the event of a conflict between India and Pakistan. What's that going to mean? Well, think it through. That means that India now has to logically push closer to Russia in an attempt to secure energy. And that in turn means getting closer to Iran, because in addition to Iran being a potential source of energy itself, it is also through the north-south transport corridor, which I spoke about to Carlos Roa on the pod last week. Iran is also, through that corridor, India's gateway to Russia and Central Asia's energy resources. Finally, I think it will prompt Delhi to continue its policy of détente with Beijing as a means of influencing Pakistan's behavior, which has now obviously become much more important that Pakistan has hooked up with the main supplier of Indian energy, right? So in short, I think it'll actually, in some small way, this announcement will push India towards even further integration with the emerging Eurasian order led by Russia and China and potentially even India in the future. Finally, the other big player I think this is good news for is Turkey. Pakistan and Turkey have been allies. They've cooperated in aiding Azerbaijan, for example. If Turkey's burgeoning influence within the region, in Syria now, in Azerbaijan, in Egypt as well even, it just recently had joint naval exercises with the Egyptian Navy. If that burgeoning influence is unified with Saudi Arabia's position within Islam, it's the location of Mecca and Medina, two of the three holiest places in the Islamic religion. If Turkey's influence is linked with Pakistani military power and Saudi Arabia's moral place within Islam, then wow, Turkey's neo-Ottoman ambitions receive a big boost, don't they? It would also mean that probably Iran has to at least try to mend or improve relations with Turkey to balance the Saudi-Pakistani relations somehow. That would be complicated by Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan has its own kind of greater Azerbaijan ambitions within the region, both within Armenia and within Iran itself, where there's a big ethnic Azerbaijani diaspora. But Azerbaijan is the only other Shia nation within the region, and Tehran cannot afford really to allow itself to be completely isolated. So they'll likely try to find some common ground, I believe, with Ankara, which further strengthens Ankara's position within the region. So India's kind of lost out, but will be forced to push close to the Eurasian powers. Russia's quite happy because India will be forced to do that. China's very happy. It extends its influence ever farther westward, ever farther into the Persian Gulf. And Ankara, Turkey, is probably happy as well. But what about the US? The US might be leaving the Middle East and Europe to concentrate on other matters, but surely it's not going to be happy handing an area as resource-rich as the Middle East to some combination of China and Turkey. Surely it's not going to be happy losing Europe entirely because that's its bridge onto the Eurasian landmass. So what will it do? What will it do as it seeks to leave but still wants to maintain some control? Well, the solution to that, the classic response, would be to try to leave some kind of blocking powers behind it, some kind of means of blocking, while also isolating and pressuring key players within that region. So is the US doing that? Well, let's have a look at recent news, shall we? In recent years, the governments of Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and most recently Nepal have all been overthrown by revolution, and they've all been replaced by more pro-US governments. Okay, now far be it from me to suggest that the US has, the usual agencies within the US have orchestrated these regime changes, but I'm just pointing out that they've all been replaced by more pro-US governments, and they all surround India. They all form a bloc that can prevent India and China from trading with each other. And they all pressure India. Well, what else is happening? Well, the US is moving towards improving relations with Pakistan. We've seen that constantly. Now they have that pro-US Pakistani government. Donald Trump recently announced that he was looking to open Bagram Air Base. That's right on India's doorstep. It's right on Iran's doorstep. It can control the Indian Ocean. That is not good news for India. That piles more pressure on India. And Trump has also recently ended India's waiver on helping develop the Chabahar port in Iran, which is a crucial part of the aforementioned north-south transport corridor linking Russia and Central Asia with India. So that sounds very much as if the US is doing exactly what it should per classic geostrategy. Meanwhile, the US is deepening ties with the new Syrian government, which prevents Lebanon and Iran from linking up. It prevents Iranian influence moving across the Middle East. It's also put in place deals with Armenia and Azerbaijan, which flanks Iran to the north and also affects Russia's security. And finally, Poland, one of the two most pro-US states in Europe, recently closed its border crossing with Belarus, which prevents the increasingly important rail freight transport route between China and Europe from operating. It just shuts it down. If that border crossing isn't open, then stuff can't cross that border from China into Europe. Meanwhile, the other pro-US state, a big pro-US state in Europe, the UK, is, as we said right at the beginning of this voice essay, stationing its limited military resources on Europe's eastern approaches. So that's exactly what the US is doing. It's seeking to leave behind blocking powers and pressure and means of pressuring governments in these regions as it retreats from it. So that's the reason behind the two stories. That's what's happening. The US is leaving, and the things that happen when empires leave are happening. Chaos erupts. Former client states seek new security arrangements. All the players seek to set the new geopolitical landscape in their favour. And the power that leaves tries to leave behind it ways of maintaining influence within that region. Now is no different. That's what's happening. It's happening before our eyes. And that, I hope, is what multipolarity is here for. Until next week, when I hope we return to having a normal episode, farewell. Hello there, Andy Collingwood here to remind you that once a month, Multipolarity releases a special episode exclusively for our Patreon subscribers. These special episodes often involve deeper dives and longer listens, and it makes them extremely popular, and we always get a lot of great feedback about them. Amazingly, you can get access to them for only £5, dollars or euros a month. And how much is that these days? I think it's less than my wife pays for a coffee in a big paper cup to drink on the way to work in the mornings. So go to Patreon, type in Multipolarity the podcast and sign up. When you do, you'll get the full back catalogue and all the future special episodes. You can cancel at any time, but nobody ever does because it's a blinding deal. So, sign up, pay some money, get a great deal. Now, back to the show.
Well, to the surprise of no one who listens to Multipolarity, the podcast, Argentina is collapsing. The economy is collapsing, and the popularity of Javier Milei, the country's quirky libertarian president, is also collapsing. We predicted this pretty much when Milei got elected. And we might get into the reasons why it was so obvious that this was going to happen in a few moments. But first, what's going on? Well, Milei lost a local election. This would be a shock to anyone who follows kind of opinion polling, or at least generally the vibes of the opinion polling in the Argentinian economy. I don't follow Argentinian approval ratings of Milei very closely. I mean, I don't care that much, to be honest. I always knew what would eventually happen, so it didn't really matter. So maybe there's some good polling out there that's actually reliable and reflects reality. But as I'll talk about in a moment, there's a ton of PR and self-congratulatory media that swirls around, which is basically what the entire Milei phenomenon is built on. So his party lost this local election quite badly. As far as I can tell from the reporting, his party far underperformed the polls. Again, back to this potential that maybe the polls are kind of fake, just raising the possibility, and part of some sort of a PR campaign. But they lost the local elections in Argentina, and this apparently led to destabilization of the financial markets. I think the stock market fell something like 10% in a day. Maybe it was more than one day, I'm not so sure. And the peso's down something like 10% in 2 months or something like that. I'm sure the election did trigger what happened, but markets just wait for an event to trigger big collapses like this. The event itself very rarely matters. People like attributing complex phenomena and economic processes, political processes, and so on to a single event, and that allows them to clarify in their mind what's going on. And often, you tie a market phenomenon onto an event, and the event says something about the market phenomenon. In this case, it says Milei's policies have been a complete failure, which they have. They've made things far worse in Argentina, not better. And the markets are waking up to that. So when he loses the election, this kind of loss of confidence, as they say, kind of gives markets an excuse to move. But things have been bubbling in the financial markets around Argentina, at least since the IMF bailout a few months ago, which we talked about on the show, and which I was credibly told on Twitter by Milei fanatics was actually a good thing and the sign of the impending recovery of the Argentinian economy. So in response to Milei's economy falling apart, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, has come out and said, Milei's a great ally of ours, we have to stabilize the situation in Argentina and so on. News reports today, on the day of recording, say that Bessent is considering tapping the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Not the first time that's been used to bail out a Latin American country. It was used to bail out Mexico during the tequila crisis in 1993, if I remember correctly. But, I don't think the Exchange Stabilization Fund's been tapped in a while. And, I saw a number of 22 billion being floated around, but they took 20 billion from the IMF only a few months ago. I think it was less than a year ago. So that seems like a really blatant case of throwing good money after bad. And while $22 billion isn't an enormous amount to the United States government, it's not nothing. And as far as I understand it, the Exchange Stabilization Fund has a limited amount of funding that it can dole out. And if it's throwing 22 billion on Javier Milei, again, that seems like a lot of money if it's only going to be like a stopgap for another 6 months or something like that, which it will probably end up being. I will say I know there's some tension in the Trump administration around Milei as a figure. And this basically maps onto the internal, dispute or political disagreements around the broad ideology of the Republican Party and the conservative movement in America moving forward. One side is the kind of MAGA side, represented by people like, J.D. Vance and Trump himself, and I think everyone's familiar with these figures at this stage, and they're pretty skeptical of the whole libertarian thing. To be honest, they don't really buy it. And libertarianism is a funny thing, which I'll speak more about in a moment, but it's a funny thing in that it's the closest thing that liberals, as far as I can tell, have to a really utopian ideology. So no matter what you say about liberalism, I've just put out a book, The Collapse of Global Liberalism. I'm quite critical of liberalism in it as an ideology. But no matter what you say about liberalism, it never makes any enormous promises. It's kind of summed up, to my mind, in the figure of the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who kind of framed the entire liberal project as being about negative liberty, that is, freedom from constraints. Like, do whatever you want, or broadly do whatever you want, don't commit crimes, obviously, broadly do whatever you want, and, we don't want anyone telling you what to do, and et cetera, et cetera. And in that kind of a reading of liberalism, there's no utopia at the end of the whole thing. It's just, it's a pretty bland, almost technocratic ideology for managing political differences in society. The libertarians push that to this radical extreme. And if you read some of the libertarian literature, in my opinion at least, their vision of a society where, turbo liberalism had been implemented would look something like Marxist communism. It will be like a utopia. Everyone will be happier. Everyone will be free to do what they want, and everything will be great, and everyone will be rich, and all this stuff. So it's a real utopian ideology. It fits into those kind of things, and I think that libertarianism was kind of pretty big for a while back in the George W. Bush days. It offered an alternative to George Bush era conservatism, which was there was always kind of the tax cuts and that crowd hanging around the Bush era conservatism, but it was fairly balanced on its domestic policies. And libertarianism at least offered a different governing vision for the United States. But most importantly, libertarianism offered a different vision of foreign policy. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if some of our listeners were libertarians or are libertarians, and I'm sorry if you don't like my opinions on your ideology, but that's my honest opinion. Because libertarianism tended to take a multipolarity view of the world before multipolarity, because of their non-interventionist stances on foreign policy, which personally I always found very admirable. I think a figure like Ron Paul I don't think his economic ideas are very credible, but I do think, he's right on a lot of foreign policy issues. So that's a kind of interesting thing about libertarianism. Libertarianism's kind of disappeared. Now, after 2008, it had another blossoming because of the collapse, and there's famous libertarian approach to economic cycle theory called Austrian business cycle theory, and some people said it explained the financial crisis of 2008, and I'll just say on record, I think it has explanatory power to describe certain aspects of what happened in 2008, but I think there are superior theories on the market. I think of Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis and so on. But, I think they could credibly, the Austrian economic school could credibly say that they had a lot more to say about what happened in 2008 than, for example, mainstream neoclassical economics. But I think after 2008, it sort of dissipated over time. It will be an interesting story to tell of why it did. I know quite a bit about it. I don't think I know, I'd want to go and do a bit of reading on it. But it kind of dissipated over time. I think a lot of libertarians became comfortable with the MAGA movement. And we found that the ones that were a little bit more adaptable, the ones that were interested in the broader foreign policy critique, almost paleo-conservative political philosophy, if that means anything to anyone, they became increasingly okay with the MAGA movement and its relative agnosticism on some economic principles. And I think the only libertarians that really remained left in the United States and in Britain in particular were soft libertarians, people who actually didn't really dissent with the foreign policy back in the day. These were economists, really. I mean, most of them were economists by training or by inclination, lawyers that were interested in economics and so on. And I think they basically maintained that softer version of libertarianism where they really believed massive increases in market activity could resolve economic problems, work wonders, miracle drugs, and so on. I mean, if you're thinking of a key figure here, it's probably someone like Tyler Cowen, who is a kind of a moderate libertarian insofar as he wouldn't take the counter-cultural libertarian ideas, foreign policy ideals, and all that kind of thing, but he'd be very into tax cutting and economic deregulation and all this sort of thing. Now, these guys are having a very hard time right now. They still have a lot of funding behind them, and they still have prominent think tanks and so on, because there's a lot of donors who want taxes cut. So there's a lot of funding for these soft libertarians, and there always has been. But their ideas just don't seem that credible anymore. I don't really want to make this about me, but Tyler Cowen in particular just wrote a review of my book in the Times Literary Supplement. I didn't think it was a very good review for what it was worth, but the one thing that stood out was that he insisted that trade deficits don't matter. I think he kind of called me a sort of a crackpot and against mainstream economic theory for saying that trade deficits do matter, which is utterly bizarre. I don't even know what to say to that. Mainstream economic theory definitely says trade deficits do matter. And the recent trade deficits don't matter thing is a fairly recent development. I'm thinking in the 90s in America. Even in the 80s, there was great concern about trade deficits. It's called the twin deficits hypothesis. It was the idea that the government budget deficits fed into trade deficits, and that was used as an excuse by the later Reagan administration to try and cut spending and so on. But the point is that I think most people think trade deficits do matter. I don't just mean in the economics world. I could cite, Ben Bernanke, not exactly a fringe figure, global savings glut hypothesis and so on. But also, like, politically, obviously, a big component of the Trump movement is basically that trade deficits do matter. And it's one of the things I'm most sympathetic to the Trump movement about, because I really do think trade deficits matter. So these guys are they still think they're right. They still think they hold the holy grail of economic understanding. And they seem to think that anyone who disagrees with them is like a crank or something. But they've lost the politics to a very large extent. And there's not much chance of Tyler Cowen or any of these guys' arguments on trade deficit getting any purchase in DC anymore. Their time of trade deficits don't matter is gone. The dollar is falling as a reserve currency. This will only get more profound as time goes on. So what I think this large group have done is they've got behind Milei. And Milei as the kind of figure of what they want to do with American government. Now, I'll also say they were kind of behind Elon Musk as well, but that's actually slightly more complicated. And I don't think Elon Musk is a libertarian ideologue at all. And some of the government cuts that he was actually aiming for, I thought were quite sensible. They weren't cuts for the sake of cuts. They were cuts in parts of the bureaucracy that were highly inefficient. Musk's approach to government cuts struck me as a businessman's approach, which genuinely wasn't so much focused on saving money, although that component was there, but it was about increasing the efficiency of organizations. That is something that governments have a hard time with, and that is something that is quite positive, although very difficult to do. So I think the libertarian crowd kind of realized this, that Elon Musk wasn't one of them. Milei is one of them. In fact, he's the most one of them. This is a half-dead ideology that's been flopping around like a fish that's been thrown onto land since Trump came down the escalator in the run-up to the 2016 election. And they found their holy grail in Milei, because here's a guy who's going to really actually try out some of their ideas in practice. And the guy became a mythical figure for them. I alluded to earlier, I think libertarianism is a utopian ideology like Marxist communism. And unsurprisingly, when a great leader emerges, they deify him. They actually deified the guy, like cult of personality evolved around Milei, in that he could do no wrong. This is what people have to understand about that. Like some people say, oh, there's a cult of personality around Trump. No, Trump's just really popular. But when he does stuff that people don't like Middle East wars stuff, people push back on him because they don't think he's infallible. They thought Milei was infallible. It really got that bad. Milei himself was a public relations creation, and I suspect he was a public relations creation by these groups, by these well-funded think tank organizations who had run out of things to do politically. And so they put an awful lot of money, frankly, and media behind Javier Milei. I looked up before I started recording this essay, recent news on Milei's popularity. And an article from June came up saying he was the second most approved leader in the world. So he's the second most approved leader in the world, and then he gets absolutely wiped out, 2 or 3 months later in a local election. I haven't dug into the polls in Argentina. I haven't dug into the methodology. I suspect there's something very strange going on there. I don't think it's honest. There's something going on. It seems fake to me. But having that headline then followed by a wipeout in a local election, especially given the fact that the Argentinian economy has been taking an absolute beating since Milei got in, I just don't buy any of it anymore. I'll give another idea. There's an entire Wikipedia page, a long Wikipedia page, not devoted to Javier Milei. That's very typical. World leaders get long Wikipedia pages. No, it's devoted to the public image of Javier Milei. I'd encourage listeners to go and Google this. The public image of Javier Milei. And this isn't a short Wikipedia article. It's got pictures of him in there with the chainsaw and everything. It looks like a hagiography written by like Milei fans, but I don't think they were just, fans. I think they were also, there's probably a bit of money behind them from a certain liberal conservative think tanks. So what's actually going on in Venezuela? Why hasn't Milei been able to cut the Gordian knot on inflation and exchange rate issues? Well, the first thing to say is that Milei has made it worse. The guy went in and he trashed the place. In Argentina, they tell all the people on the conservative side of the spectrum that all their problems are caused by Peronists. And the Peronists cause these problems by cronyism and overspending by government and et cetera, et cetera. And some of these things are even echoed by people who are supposedly serious economists, I guess, on the liberal left, like Krugman. I mean, Krugman has articles out there blaming the Argentinian inflation on budget deficits. Argentina doesn't run particularly large budget deficits. Maybe they were 2% or something like that. They're not that high. I don't know why people like Krugman say things like this, except that they don't know anything about what they're talking about, and they shouldn't write about things that they don't know about. That's all I can really say about that. The real issue in Argentina has very little to do with Peronism. And when you actually understand the problem in Argentina, the fundamental underlying economic problem, you realize that Milei is probably the last pro-American figure in Argentinian politics, any serious one anyway. I think that after this crisis, Argentina is firmly going to go into the orbit of the BRICS, unless something completely drastic is done by the Americans. But I can't even begin to think what that would be. It would have to be some sort of almost economic partnership, dollarize the economy, bring it into NAFTA. It would have to be something along those lines, and like fund the dollarization of the economy. It would have to be something so extreme that I'm not sure it would even be worth it geostrategically. So basically, Argentina's problems go back to the 1970s, I think. That's basically when all the problems started. People probably know that Argentina was one of the most promising countries on the entire continent of the Americas. When immigration became too high in America in the early 20th century, European immigration from Italy, from Ireland and these countries, they pulled up the drawbridges and they said, okay, we can't absorb any more immigrants. And those immigrants then started going to Argentina, thinking that, they'd build pretty much a similar society there. And it's always been a long-standing mystery why that didn't happen. Argentina has a lot going for it. It's got a lot of natural resources. It's a big country. There's lots of space, et cetera, et cetera. And for a long time, it was doing well. It was doing very well. It was one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America. The problem started in the 70s, and it started with the military dictatorships there, which were backed by the United States. I'm not going to make this a conspiracy theory about Argentina being some sort of a testing ground from the Monroe Doctrine. I don't think that's what it was. I don't think many of the economic problems were purposely imposed on Argentina, but I think they were an effect of aspects of the Monroe Doctrine that then ended up becoming the means of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. And I don't think this latter part is even that conscious on the part of the United States. So here's basically what happened. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the Americans supported various undemocratic governments in Argentina. These governments were obsessed with militarizing Argentina, and of course, eventually they had their eyes on the Falklands Islands. But I don't think that was the only reason that they wanted to militarize. Generals like spending on military. It's just kind of like bakers like investing in dough. It's their business. And they took on onerous loans that they couldn't afford to buy weaponry. They just couldn't afford it, and they took on the loans and they bought weapons. And over time, this built serious problems into the economy. Devaluations, inflations, hyperinflations, right? And this just went on and on and on. And as it went on and on and on, and there was no means to change the government because it was a dictatorship, society started to adapt to the inflation itself. And it started to basically index everything in the society So everything would just be naturally indexed. Everyone in Argentina understands that prices rise really high. So they're used to changing wages. They're used to changing the cost of agricultural products. They're used to changing this. They're used to changing that. Inflation becomes embedded into an economy like that. And because this has been going on, this went on for 20 years or so, 20, 25 years, it became incredibly deeply embedded in the economy. It became almost part of Argentinian culture. In the 1990s, they tried to resolve this. The conservative Argentinian government tried to resolve this, and they did so by pegging the peso to the dollar under a currency board arrangement, which is the most aggressive peg. It's almost like dollarization without dollarization. There's no allowance for movements between the peso and the dollar. And this suppressed the inflation, but it was done so on the back of racking up enormous amounts of dollar debt. This is the point at which the Monroe Doctrine, in effect, starts being enforced via the financial mechanism. Again, I'll say, I don't think this was conscious. This was the result of a lot of people on Wall Street making money out of lending to Argentina in dollar hard currency loans. And then at the State Department, they were just like, well, of course we want someone in the region to be pegged to the dollar. That increases our power. I don't think they were like consciously trying to put Argentina into debt slavery, but that's effectively what was happening. And then, of course, that all blows up around the turn of the millennia. And Argentina has this massive economic crisis, one which they're probably about to see again now under Milei. And they get a Peronist government back in, and a Peronist government that really focuses on doing anything it takes to stabilize the economy. And anything it takes basically meant a load of interventions in foreign currency regimes. Some probably cooked statistics being put out there to try and calm the situation down. It was all held together with bits of string and glue, in effect, but it held together. You see, if you're managing a situation, a really imperfect disequilibrium situation like that in economics, the best you can do is the best you can do. And the Argentinian authorities realized that. They came to understand that over time. It had really nothing to do with Peronism or left-wing ideology or right-wing ideology or anything like that. They just figured out this was the best way to make the best out of a bad situation. And it also ensured that they didn't run up too much, foreign currency debt, too much hard currency debt, which will create a genuine crisis. And that's basically what happened in Argentina for years. Well, then there's an interlude where Macri gets elected and tries once again to reimpose the 90s a few years ago. I may have mentioned on the show that I actually worked as an analyst very briefly on one of those debt deals. And I immediately knew what was going to happen because I knew the dynamics of the economy. Anyway, the Macri thing didn't really work out. And that faction in Argentina, I think, became increasingly convinced that only the most radical intervention would work. That faction in Argentina, by the way, is very tied to Wall Street and America. And they became increasingly convinced that only really extreme measures would work. Milei kind of comes up via the populist route independently. I don't think there was some conspiracy here. But he comes up during that wave of populists. You think higher Bolsonaro in Brazil. And of course, all this was inspired by Trumpism and rising populism in Europe. And when he finally gets, I guess, electable or elected, this group that had been trying to fix the economic problems through neoliberal interventions, very much so tied to Wall Street, very much so tied to America. But again, I'm not trying to portray them as some imperialist or anything like that. I don't think so. I think they honestly thought their ideas would work. And they had subscribed to a slightly crude, orthodox, soft libertarian theory, the likes of which Tyler Cowen and people like that espouse. A simplistic, very simplistic understanding of economics. It's almost economics as an ideology rather than as a scientific approach, is how I describe it. And they threw all their weight behind Milei. Well, it's failing now. There's no more excuses. There'll be some whining, there'll be some blaming it on Peronist influence and Maduro and everything like that. And it wasn't real libertarianism, we'll hear. No true libertarianism, just like you hear with the Soviet Union. You'll hear all that, but look, it's over. This is over now. And I don't know how bad the crisis in Argentina is going to get, My suspicion is quite bad, but eventually Milei is going to get thrown out and a Peronist candidate is going to be put in place. And that's where the multipolarity angle comes in. Because this is last chance saloon now. These guys who wanted to try and fix the economy through tough medicine had their shot. They really had their shot and it failed. They're done. They're completely discredited now. So the entire American neoliberal solution to the Argentinian problem is done. And it's probably done in America too, because as I mentioned, there's people in the Trump administration and in the Trump movement and the new conservative movement, whatever you want to call it, who were deeply skeptical of Javier Milei to begin with. They're going to be vindicated. We on Multipolarity are going to be vindicated. And all those people who are making excuses about Peronists under the bed, stealing the family gold, they're not going to be credible. It's just going to be kind of a coping mechanism for their ideology collapsing in front of them in real time. But most people won't pay attention to it. So where is it going to go? Well, eventually the Americans are going to realize that they're throwing money into a black hole and that the entire Javier Milei thing was a grift. It was a big PR campaign. And eventually they're going to pull back from that because you can't throw money into a black hole forever. And Americans really don't like throwing money into a black hole. One of the countries in the world that hates doing it most. The Europeans are far more adept at that than the Americans. But the Americans don't like doing it. So the Americans inevitably are going to pull back from Argentina. If maybe even if they get sick of Milei coming to Washington with a begging bowl every 6 months, maybe he'll become the next kind of Zelensky figure in that regard. I don't know. Or maybe he'll maintain his popularity enough until he gets ousted. At that point, you get a Peronist government, and the US will gradually start to lose interest. What's the next logical step? The BRICS. That's where this is going. The BRICS. And perhaps even some sort of regional currency arrangement in Latin America. It would be a big thing to swallow for example, the Brazilians, because they have a pretty stable currency and they have a pretty stable economy. And if they had to hitch the wagon to Argentina in a currency arrangement of some sort, it would not be costless short term. It might not even be costless medium term. But in the long term, there's a lot of promise there. And if it was brokered by a larger power, I'm thinking maybe China, that buys a lot of soy from Argentina and buys a lot of steel, or iron ore, I should say, from Brazil, I can kind of see things firming up. I'm not saying that a plan will emerge overnight. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying the moment has now come for when a Peronist gets in to a completely discredited neoliberal program having fallen apart behind it, just like what happened in the early 2000s in Argentina, they're also going to have this new world open up where they can say, okay, maybe we can finally have something new. Because they kind of understand in some shape or form, probably in a more conspiratorial way than I do, that there is some sort of a thing going on with the relationship between Argentina and the dollar-based system. The system that's in decline in and of itself. So I think this is the moment. This is the big moment. And I just don't see any way that the United States can do anything about this. As I said, they'd have to do something like accept Argentina into NAFTA, dollarize the economy and pay for it, etc., etc. There's no money for that. There's no will for that. There's only a few lobbyists and think tanks and so on in DC who are really focused on this project because, frankly, they have nothing else to say right now, and they have to keep the lights on. So that's the way this is going, and we predicted it from day one. If you want to go back and listen to the original episode we did on Milei, I'm fairly sure that not only did we predict this would happen, but we also said that it would rein in a new era of BRICS influence in Latin America.